We are streaming.
Wonderful, thank you so much. 5 o'clock, we're going to call the July 20th, 2022 Quality of Life meeting to order. Loretta, if I could please get a roll call.
Yes. Counselor Chavez? Here. Counselor Lee Garcia?
Here.
Counselor Michael Garcia?
Present.
Counselor Villarreal?
Present.
Chair Cassett?
Here.
You have a quorum, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Moving on to approval of the agenda, we have one change. We are going to be removing item P from the consent calendar. Are there any other changes from staff or from the committee?
No changes, Madam Chair.
And if not, can I get a motion to approve as amended?
Move to approve as amended.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Moving on to approval of the consent agenda, are there items from members of the committee they'd like to hear? Councilor Michael Garcia?
I'd like to remove item Q.
Any additional items?
Just also like to, more information on item Q as well. Thank you.
Councilman Villarreal, did you have another one? Correct. Okay, so I have Q and R, correct? And can I get a motion to approve as amended?
Move to approve as amended.
Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Moving on to the approval of the minutes from the July 6th Quality of Life Committee meeting. Are there any changes from staff or from the committee?
No changes, Madam Chair.
Any changes from the committee? Loretta, it looks like we are still having some challenges with a few of the items on here. Is that still something that we can't change at this point?
Are you talking, are you,
We still have
the minutes?
Counselor Chavez referred to as Member Chavez.
Yes, Jeff is working on that, and it might be corrected by the next, it's, I believe, corrected going forward. I'm not sure if we can correct it.
Right, it's on, and we also have Member Garcia, it looks like, as well.
Yes.
And then are we able to correct the fact that it's not specifying Michael Garcia versus Lee Garcia?
He was working on that last I heard talk to Jeff.
Okay.
Going forward, I will confirm that tomorrow morning.
Okay, so moving forward, we will be able to make those changes. So there have been some challenges with PrimeGov with the Quality of Life Committee meeting, Quality of Life Committee minutes. But staff is aware of them and are working to update them in PrimeGov, just so you all are aware. And with that, is there a motion?
Move to approve.
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Any opposed? Okay, moving on to presentations. We have findings and recommendations for growing and sustaining early childhood education and care in Santa Fe. We have Julie Sanchez from Youth and Family Services and Rachel Kutcher presenting. So welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for being here.
Madam Chair, just to clarify what items we're pulling, because the agenda and the public, go ahead.
Sometime between yesterday and today, the agenda was refreshed and the items were changed, because last night, item Q was the major commercial event ordinance, and now on today's agenda, it is item P.
So item P has been removed from the agenda.
Correct. My question is, what was changed? I can sit here and go back and forth to see what was changed, but what I'm trying to point out is an agenda that was available all the way up to the public until yesterday is not the exact same agenda that is published today.
Loretta, was there any changes to the agenda since Friday?
The last change was that there was a duplicate. They were the same, and I believe Jeff removed the duplicate.
And when did the removal occur?
It occurred after the agenda was published on Friday. It was discovered, I believe, on Monday. I was informed that there was a duplicate, so we contacted Jeff, and he removed one of the items.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification, Loretta.
You're welcome.
And Madam Chair, can I just clarify, since there's folks here for different items, I'm not sure what, but the ones that were pulled off for discussion are,
So the ones pulled off from discussion is Q, and that is a resolution updating the terms of approval included in resolution number 2020-24 and 2022-9 to change the permitted location of banners commemorating hometown heroes from the Cerrillos Road corridor to the rail yard. And then R was also pulled, which is a resolution adopting new procedural rules for city council standing committees. So that is what will be discussed. Item P, which was an ordinance amending section 23-5.2 SFCC 1987 to specify that major commercial events are not entitled to use city property that is otherwise leased by the city, is no longer being considered tonight. That item has been postponed, so it will not be discussed this evening.
Madam Chair, I got a question on that. Because it was scheduled to go to governing body next week, does that mean it's going to be pulled off of governing body schedule for next week?
Correct.
Okay.
That is my understanding. It has been pulled from the agenda and has been postponed by the sponsors.
Thank you so much.
I apologize, Director Sanchez and Ms. Kutcher. The floor is now yours. Thank you so much for allowing us that detour.
No worries. Thank you all for having us this evening. I want to make sure I give the floor and introduce Ms. Kutcher, who's been working on this project for the division over the last 8-ish months, 10 months. And so I'll go ahead and give her the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of council. So this presentation is really sort of wrapping up the conclusion of my contract, looking at early childhood education and care and the landscape analysis in the city of Santa Fe. So just to give you an overview of the scope of this work over that time. So it really was intended to be an overview of the current landscape of early childhood education and care in Santa Fe, and to some degree across New Mexico, just because there's a lot of state policy and funding that impacts the city child care system, and really with a focus on ages 0 to 5, and specifically in care settings. So early childhood education and care is often defined as prenatal to 8, and also includes other services like home visiting, early intervention, many other programs and services. But this project really focused on that scope of 0 to 5 before children can generally enter a universal public K-12 system. There was also a lot of local and statewide data that I included, and then conducted interviews with local early childhood education and care providers, and looked at policies and best practices nationally as well. So back in February, you remember that I presented to this committee on that local and statewide data, a lot around workforce projects happening in Santa Fe for the early childhood workforce, as well as the impact of the pandemic on early childhood education and care providers and the systems, and recommendations for use of ARPA funding. And so these 2 additional reports that were submitted in June focus on different strategies for growing and sustaining early childhood education and care in Santa Fe. A lot of that was based on those interviews with providers, as well as some additional information about other areas of need and resources, and then a report focused almost exclusively on current early childhood education and care funding in Santa Fe and statewide, as well as strategies for funding in local municipalities across the country. The city and the council have already done a lot to support early childhood education and care this year. So you passed an ordinance that amended the land development code to permit preschool and child care facilities by right in all zoning districts except for the industrial districts, and committed ARPA funds to the early childhood teacher apprenticeship pilot program at the college. And the fire marshal also engaged in some conversations about fire code barriers for home-based care providers. So those have been some really great city investments already in this need, and this report provides recommendations for other things that the city could do to further support the industry. So to start with, I'm just going to provide some more information about the provider interviews and the recommendations that came out of that. So I interviewed 13 center-based licensed providers, and that's out of 24 total, so about half in the city. Most of those are single site. They just have one center-based location. There are some primarily Head Start, early Head Start, that have numerous locations across the city and county. And then I also interviewed 2 home-based licensed providers, and that's out of only 7 total, so about a third. And worked on with Julie and with Counselor Cassett and some others, some structured interview questions so that we were really being consistent in what we were asking across providers. So I'm not going to go through all of these themes, but these are all the themes that came up in provider interviews and were the focus of some of the questions, and so that should give you a good sense of the contents of that report and how that is organized by themes. One of my top recommendations is that the city develop a dedicated funding stream to support early childhood education and care in Santa Fe. The state has done a lot over the last few years to really invest in early childhood education and care, and they're making some good progress. But this is a system that has been so underinvested, and both at the federal and the state level in the past, that the gaps are still quite large. And in the report in the funding report, there's more information that really outlines what investments are currently coming in through the state and some of the size of that remaining gap. So some of the highest priority needs are really around space and capital funding. We have a really old building stock in Santa Fe, which has been a challenge for existing programs and new programs in terms of maintenance and emergency maintenance that comes up sometimes. And also there's licensure requirements around what the space looks like for a child care setting, particularly for those young children, infants, and toddlers. And so often there's renovations that are needed to make it possible to provide care and to get licensed in a building. And then new construction, purchasing buildings, everything is also just very expensive in Santa Fe, as you know. Subsidies to provide infant and toddler care are really important. That's our biggest gap in terms of licensed care spots, is for infants and toddlers. And part of that is because it's very expensive to provide infant and toddler care. There is a very low adult to child ratio required for that care. It makes it very expensive, and it's very hard for most programs to provide that, or to provide it at a large scale. So a lot of programs that are providing it are subsidizing it with revenues from their care for older children, and they're having to limit the number of infant and toddler classrooms they can provide. A lot of other providers are just choosing not to do it because of the financial calculus for that. Wage support for early childhood educators would also really support the workforce. There's a lot of difficulty with recruitment and retention, largely because wages are low, and wages are low because the the income margins for early childhood education and care are so low. Support to pursue higher focus star ratings or national accreditation. So the state uses a quality rating system, and that requires a lot of work. It requires lower ratios, so that becomes more expensive. You have more adults to fewer children, and then there's also quite a few requirements to move up those quality star ratings or to achieve a national accreditation. And child care assistance reimbursement rates are tied to those focus ratings, so they become important to long-term sustainability. Summer and aftercare programming, a lot of programs talked about as a challenging expense, and the city is already supporting one pre-K program during the summer when the state is not funding it through CYC dollars, but there's really a need for a more consistent approach across all of our early childhood providers for that. There's a lot around teacher and educator, higher education and professional development, because there's a lot in the February report on that. I won't go into more detail. And since the start of the pandemic, the Early Childhood Education and Care Department has been waiving family co-pays for child care assistance for all families who are under 200% of the federal poverty level, and then as of May of this year, they began to waive those co-pays for all families in child care assistance up to 400% of the federal poverty level, but they're using ARPA funding to pay for those copay waivers right now, and so that's currently expected to expire in June 2023, and of course ARPA funding is not a recurring source, and so unless they find other funds to substitute that, that'll become a big need for families to financially access care. There were also some interests around parent and family classes and business startup costs, including for home-based providers. So other recommendations that came up is thinking about if the city could provide wraparound care when early childhood programs are closed. So Head Start, based on their federal funding, does not operate in the summer. Early Head Start does, but so that's ages 0 to 3, and then ages 3 to 5 for Head Start funding does not operate during the summer, and public pre-K, of course, is also closed during the summer. So that provides a big gap for families. The city should consider opening new infant and toddler care classrooms, whether that's directly or through contracts with existing local providers, to really help subsidize that cost and make sure that we've got that available infant and toddler care in the community. And then also training Connect Navigators on child care assistance eligibility and enrollment. So in the first report, there's some data about how many families don't even really know what child care assistance is or if they're eligible. And so there is a big gap in terms of financially paying for child care, which doesn't solve our supply issue, but is important for family access. The providers also brought up a lot of issues around accessing developmental and behavioral supports, particularly for children ages 3 to 5. The state's FIT program covers ages 0 to 3 and seems to be working fairly well, but when developmental and behavioral supports or responsibility for addressing those needs shifts to the school districts at age 3, they're running into a lot of challenges. And so engaging the state and schools in that conversation is important. And then there wasn't a lot of appetite from our current providers to provide care during non-traditional hours, and it may also not be what families most need. If you're thinking about people who are working late nights or overnights, they may need more home-based care solutions. And so engaging, helping employers to engage in some conversations with their employees and really identify where the greatest needs are and really building some strategies to support from there. But that may not look like our current system. And then providers also are struggling with substitutes because currently the background checks that are required are tied to the individual center, program, or employer. And so potentially advocating for a state regulatory change that would allow providers to create a shared substitute teacher pool would really help. Specifically in city zoning, permitting, and fire code, there are some fire code barriers specifically for home-based care providers. The fire marshal was great at engaging in some conversations in that, and we weren't able to identify a clear strategy or solution just yet. And so, including whether that really needs to be addressed at the city policy level or at the state policy level, because the city fire code that's been adopted was adopted based on the code that the state fire marshal had adopted. So looking at more at that issue, and then also identifying a point person at the city that can help prospective or new child care providers to really understand and navigate permitting and fire inspection. Programs, the programs I talked to mostly have been operating a long time. Once they're in operation, renewing things, renewing their fire inspection, all that has not been an issue, but they did talk about how daunting it is when you're in that startup phase. Something we didn't look at, but I think is really important, is identifying city fees required for home-based care providers, which are on top of fees that they also have for the state inspection, and seeing if those are a potential barrier, and if rejections or adjustments to those are possible. And then this really ties back to the funding, but funding for fire suppression updates should be included in future funding opportunities for early childhood because it was identified as a need. Physical space and capital was probably one of the most frequently mentioned needs in terms of both current operations and opening new programs. Santa Fe Public Schools, as you probably all know this year, announced that they were opening an early childhood education center for ages 0 to 3 specifically for their employees. And it's of limited size, but is a really great pilot using existing space in a public school building. That space had already been designed specifically to be licensed for early childhood. Head Start was actually occupying it previously. So there may be some renovations that would be needed to make other spaces available. But engaging with the school district to see if there's possibilities for collaboration to provide space, whether the district then directly operates those programs or if there's the possibility to contract with external providers. Also looking at opportunities to renovate existing city buildings to provide space for early childhood education and care, or include spaces that could be licensed that meet the licensing requirements during new construction. So a few projects that I know are underway right now and could be relevant are Midtown Campus and the Arroyo de los Chemizos Crossing project land purchase. And so thinking more about those opportunities. And then identifying strategies to provide long-term lease spaces to early childhood education programs, potentially to reduce cost in exchange for services because those overhead costs are so high for programs. And finally, just thinking about other funding mechanisms to support capital costs, so potentially a revolving loan fund, capital grants for renovations or maintenance, and again, this emergency repairs fund also kept coming up. The city might also consider operating child care as a basic community service. So assessing the city's readiness to do that, just like cities like Albuquerque and other cities around the country have done. And that could be providing care specifically for staff as an employer, or for making that available to the general public as well. I think on the staff side, starting with a survey of the city's staff to really understand the need and demand for an early learning center for city employees would be really critical. And potentially, if the city is addressing care needs for staff, that becomes a recruitment and retention tool as well. And then consider contracting with existing early childhood education and care providers, whether, again, that's to provide care just for city staff or for the broader community and city-owned buildings. And then employer-supported child care. So there's a lot that employers could also do to contribute to the supply. The Santa Fe Chamber of Commerce and Growing Up New Mexico did a survey with employers in April about this, and I learned the other week have also convened a subsequent working group. So I think step one is to talk to them and see how that work can be supported. There is some work the city could potentially do also around educating local businesses about federal and state tax credits, and about a state child care supply building grant right now that includes employers as eligible applicants, but it doesn't include the business development plan phase of, or business plan development for employers, and so maybe even funding that so that employers could be ready to apply for state funding. And then the federal tax credit, the way it's designed right now, isn't really helpful to nonprofit or governmental employers, and so there's a GAO report about potential changes to that, and so there could be an advocacy role for the city there. The last piece that I'll just briefly touch on is that there's an entire report on funding mechanisms for early childhood education and care, and so I'll just give you a quick overview of the categories that were addressed in that. So there's a few different ways that local communities, cities, counties across the country are allocating funds specifically for early childhood education and care. One way to do that is a budget allocation, and a governing body could do that annually, but it's not particularly sustainable, especially as elected officials change over time. Some cities have also in their charters set a percentage of the city annual budget that goes towards early childhood education and care. There's a lot of entities, particularly counties, that have done property taxes, whether that's a new tax or a percentage set aside of existing taxes, and that can be uniformly applied. There could be higher rates for homes over a specific value or not continuously occupied. Some cities have a split roll, so different types of buildings and properties have different tax rates. And then there's also a strategy for a real estate transfer tax or fee for high value properties. There are many communities that are also using a sales tax. The city already does this for some other special initiatives, like the Children and Youth Commission and the Human Services Committee. And again, that can look like a new tax or a percentage set aside. There's a few communities that have local income taxes. Since Santa Fe doesn't currently have that, that could be a big infrastructure lift, but it is something that some communities used. Cannabis cultivation taxes came up quite a bit, or other taxes on specific goods, so tobacco, nicotine, alcohol. And then recently, just this year actually, Colorado, at the state legislature, expanded their eligible uses for lodgers tax to include affordable housing and early childhood education and care, recognizing the impact of tourism on those other areas and the need for that for their tourism and hospitality workforce. And so that's another strategy. So in terms of this funding stream area specifically, I think that the real immediate next steps are determining whether or not the city is really interested in pursuing that. And if so, taking a few of those potential revenue streams and doing some additional and really focused research and analysis on potential revenues from that, potential impact, and also voter support, because a lot of these do require voter approval. And creating a steering committee to look at the purpose and use of proposed funds. The Children's Funding Project is a national organization which specifically is focused on supporting local municipalities to develop dedicated funding streams for children's services or early childhood services. And so they have a really great resource on kind of all of the steps for doing that. And so I'd also refer you to them for that. So that's everything that I wanted to share. There's a lot more in the report as well, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ms. Kutcher, and thank you, Director Sanchez, for being here and for all your work over the last, 6 months that you've been at this. It was a very heavy lift, and I really appreciate all 3 very detailed reports that you've put forward on these different topics. So thank you so much. Really, really helpful. Any questions from members of the committee? Councilman Villarreal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for the work you put in for this very comprehensive report. I read one of them, and then I'm like, wait, there's another one. How did I miss this one? So The one I read was what you presented on. The other one seemed to address some of the same issues. Can you remind me what there were, not issues, but it kind of covered a lot of the same topics. What was the difference that I missed?
Sure. So there's 3 reports,
Right.
and there's a few areas of duplication. For the most part, they're not duplicative, but there are a few areas that just was needed for clarity or to update some data. So the first report is really, the one in February was really focused on existing local and statewide data, COVID-19 impact, early childhood workforce strategies that are already underway in the city, and ARPA recommendations. And there was also some licensure data and data on kind of those gaps, which has been updated in one of the June reports. So the 2 June reports, one was focused on a lot on the interviews with providers and those themes that I went through, which was the main focus of the report today. The third was really on the funding piece. So I think there was a little bit of that's another place there was some overlap. There was a little bit of funding in the first report, but I repeated it in that third report just to make sure that it was comprehensive and it wasn't missing anything. So that third report is current funding for early childhood education and care in Santa Fe, a lot of which is state funding.
Right.
And then a lot of detailed tables about all these examples of different funding mechanisms from other communities.
Okay, so I think I pretty much got all the coverage, and I think what was exciting to me, and then also kind of like, oh, how do we prioritize? Is there's a lot you all covered so many different areas that are part of childhood education and care, and I was trying to figure out what's first, what do we do first? And I know, thanks to Councilwoman Cassett, we have done some things that have moved forward that I think were low-hanging fruit, and then there's these other kind of structural changes that need to happen, and then also physical changes that potentially could happen. And so I guess I'm curious about if you had to prioritize out of all of the things that are being not requested, but recommendations, how would you then prioritize those? Based on even like what you've heard from staff and then the working group, but I'm just...
Yeah, I mean, if I have to pick one, I think that would be hard. If I could pick just a few,
Yes.
I would say I think a funding stream is really important. I think there's more work to be done then on prioritizing proposed uses of that funding stream, but that there just are such large funding gaps for early childhood education and care that's really critical. I think physical space and capital needs is really big and is something that the city, as an entity that owns a lot of property and that also has access to capital funds, that's really important and is something the city could impact. I think infant and toddler care, whether that's the city providing it, the city subsidizing it through contracts or physical space, because there's just such an acute need. I provided updated licensure data in one of the June reports, and that's just, you can see how big those gaps are. And then the last thing I would say is thinking about care for city employees as an employer, particularly if you're looking to other employers to help with the child care supply, really being a leader in that space.
Thank you. Thanks for that. That was kind of where I was thinking about, but then I guess what really stood out for me is really taking an initiative for us to find out how many city employees could use care. I actually think it might be higher than we think. I was just at IT today, and one of our employees had her child there with her because the programming, whatever she was doing that day, was over, and there was this gap time period. So I just think that that would be something that we should do to support our employees right off the bat. And then, it's part of the bigger structure too. One question I was curious about is how many of the providers you interviewed were nonprofits versus for-profits?
That's a great question, and I actually would need to go back, I think, and look at the list, because I have a good sense of who is nonprofit and for-profit, but I didn't count it up and really look at it that way. I guess I will say broadly, we do have quite a few nonprofit providers. But yeah, I'm not sure quite what the division is. I'd have to go look and get back to you on that.
And I ask that because I think about, and maybe Julie could answer this, if the nonprofit groups, if they would be eligible for any funding that we have through city grants that are in your department. And I don't know if that's something that we've thought about, at least for the nonprofit sectors, or nonprofit organizations.
So, Madam Chair, Councilor Villarreal, so we do fund nonprofit early child care providers.
Okay.
Our funding is, it's a pretty small pool that's very distributed pretty broadly, but generally we try to fund at least 2 agencies or 3 agencies. Rachel had brought up filling in that gap for summer and after school. A lot of city funding does that, and that's a majority of where our funding is going, as well as in early intervention services. So we do fund it, but it's just not a robust, dedicated stream of funding to support all of those programs.
Got it. Okay. And then the other question I was curious about is out of those, because I don't have a child, so I don't know all the providers and who provides what kind of services, and how many of them that you interviewed actually provide sliding scale opportunities for their services versus like more expensive high-end?
Yeah, so I didn't ask about sliding scale. We should have in retrospect. We did ask about a lot of different funding sources that they take, and I think the most relevant there really becomes child care assistance, because there are some gaps potentially for children who were not U.S. born to access that, but as long as children have a social security number and citizenship, even if their parents do not, if the family is income eligible, the children are eligible for child care assistance, and so sliding fee becomes a little bit less relevant if the provider is accepting child care assistance.
And did all of those accept child care assistance that you interviewed?
That's a great question. Not everybody does, and I do provide a little more detail in the report on that. Most of the providers do. A few do not accept it at all, but also there's a group of providers who accept it, but they're limiting the number of children in their programs who are on child care assistance because the reimbursement rates are too low for it to be financially sustainable for them. Particularly if they're lower than a 5-star quality rating, which is the highest reimbursement rate. And so there's some real issues around that, and I think any strategy to address that needs to look at both family access as well as the financial well-being of those providers, since even for-profit providers are not operating with a significant profit margin.
Yeah, I guess I think about we're looking at the providers and what their needs are, and also, staffing issues. And then simultaneously, I'm thinking about where the need is in Santa Fe and what demographics are needing childcare. Maybe it's across the board, but I think when we start looking at the numbers, maybe I don't know if that data was collected, but maybe there are actually more low-income families that actually need that child care support or that option, and then also having the child care assistance option too. I guess I was just thinking about how those compare, if that makes sense, like the need out there and then how it relates to our providers. Did I miss that somewhere in the report?
So there is, in the first report in February, there is some kind of information both from state and local surveys and data that give you a sense of what the need is, and then the licensure data, which was updated in one of the June reports, does give you a sense of the licensed care slots versus the children in each age group. And I used a little bit of kind of the same formula that the state did in a finance report to estimate what the true demand is, but we don't have comprehensive data that can really line up this is the demand and for each income group versus, which providers are providing these spots and at what with what funding sources and all of that. There's just not comprehensive data for that. But I think the closest you can get is really looking at that licensure versus number of children per age group and multiplied by some percentages.
Thank you for that. I'm interested in that. I don't know if the Growing New Mexico or Growing Santa Fe now? Growing Up New Mexico, if they've collected that data specific for Santa Fe. Probably for the county, though, I would think. The demand for childcare and,
They have a list of reports on their website, and several of their reports in that February report, I included data from several of their reports in there, and so I think that's the closest that we'll get. There's just not a comprehensive, census type of survey for that.
Okay.
But I think there is some data in there that'll give you a sense of what families are saying their needs are.
Thank you so much.
Add a little bit to that conversation, because it is a frequent one at all of the childhood meetings, is that capturing what the need for childcare is in the community becomes really challenging for a couple reasons. One, just trying to get that whole population. People are, frequently having children, or children are graduating into the public school system. But also the sense that if there was more childcare available, people would want more childcare. So it's kind of the way that they're doing some of these surveys is like, are you in childcare? Are you having enough? And what they tend to find is that as kind of spaces start to open up, the kind of demand starts to move, because then parents see the opportunity to put their child in childcare and then return to the workforce. So it's kind of this really interesting, it's a bit of an iterative process that as both access to funding primarily through the state and their expansion of support of early childhood education and supporting families up to 400% of FPL, as well as when there are more spaces that are offering the hours that actually meet parents' needs, that then suddenly the demand also starts to tick up a little bit. So kind of it's a challenging one to pin down.
Thank you. Thanks for that additional information. And I guess I was thinking about that state funding that we'll have to vote on, I believe, right? Right? And then if that passes, then, so if that passes, wouldn't that be then a viable source for a lot of the things we talked about? Maybe I'm missing or maybe there's an age thing. I think there was I don't know. You tell me.
Sure. So if the land grant permanent fund amendment passes, that will represent a significant influx of additional funding. And a lot of folks who I talk to don't think that will fully meet the need. Certainly in things like physical and space and capital needs, that's just not currently addressed under state funding for early childhood education and care, and so not likely to be addressed under that. And if you look at the state's four-year finance plan for all early childhood services, which includes not only early childhood education and care, but home visiting, early intervention, forgetting some other services, but they're out there. There is, providers mentioned last week at an early childhood steering committee meeting the need for pre-K rates to increase. They haven't increased in several years, apparently. It's just not going to fully fill that gap. So if you look at the amount that the state finance plan says that they need to reach saturation points and to also increase reimbursement rates across all of those services, and then you look at the projections that the land grant permanent fund will bring in, there's still a gap of, I want to say it was a few $100 million. So it's going to help for sure, but I don't think it will fully meet those needs.
Thank you. Thank you for all the information and your knowledge and for the work you do. But do you want to share something more?
If I could just add, when we had talked earlier about the ARPA funding and how that was not a permanent funding stream, the land grant fund would fill in that gap too. So that's something else just to add.
Thank you, Julie. That's all I have. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, ladies.
Thank you so much, Councilwoman. Any other questions from members of the committee? Councilor Michael Garcia?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Kutcher and Ms. Sanchez. Not really a question, just thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate it. One thing that you highlighted in your presentation that I've continuously advocated for is the repurposing of city buildings. We've got a lot of our buildings that have either been utilized for childcare or teen space that's not being used, or space that will, hopefully we can use, such as Lafarge Library. When we build this new innovative library over at Fogelson, what better space than utilizing and repurposing Lafarge? And I think that's where, thank you for pointing that out, because it helps to ensure that the city is investing its resources that's already been developed, the infrastructure that's there. All we need to do is begin to invest in the resources to develop the infrastructure of the support system needed based off of the needs of the area. To kind of get back to the example I gave of Lafarge, I mean, what better way for it to have a Midtown area teen center? We know we've got one coming online here and soon for the south side. What better area to service the needs of that youth, the youth in that immediate surrounding area? So thank you for that's critical, and I think we need to begin as a city to start thinking with that lens on what do we have, what can we repurpose, what can we use to build these support systems, because I think not only is it needed, but I think the support and resources are there now for it. So thank you so much for the presentation tonight.
Counselor, any other questions or comments from the committee? Counselor Lee Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So looking at overall Santa Fe, when you take a look at childcare need based on income, where is the biggest need in the city? Is it people who live on the south side and work here, or and where would be the best strategically for that to take place?
The question is geographically where is the
Geographically,
most? I think some more work would be needed to identify that, actually. I mean, we know the majority of our young children live on the south side,
Right.
But I think that becomes a question for families of, where do you want care? Do you want it close to home? Do you want it close to where you work? Where do you work? And so I think that's an area where some more work with families could be done to really help identify those geographic needs.
Right, and again, this question based upon, I know everybody works, most everybody works, but the working class that absolutely needs places for their children to be when they're at work, and I think that's the biggest target and the hardest. I know for myself, when my kids were young, that was the most difficult. Where do our kids go that's safe, where they can not be safe, but also have the opportunity to learn and be in an environment where they're comfortable and then that's affordable, because that's the hardest part, is the affordability of it all. And so I just want to thank you guys for the report, and whatever we can do to help support this going forward, please reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Counselor Chavez.
Thank you, Chair Cassett. I just wanted to thank you for the presentation, but to comment on Counselor Garcia's or expand on his question. I think a good point of reference is school populations, because I think we're seeing school populations decrease in a certain area of town, and we're seeing school populations increase in a certain area of town, and I think that is very clear, and that trend has been pretty steady, right, where we see a lot of east side school populations decreasing drastically, numbers dropping very significantly, and then on the south side, certain elementary schools, high schools, there's a population's just booming, right? The school just keeps, we need more and more and more. Have you guys considered those populations within elementary school and kind of assessing the need? Because I feel like that's kind of the trend of growth, and that data exists within the schools.
So in these reports, we didn't look at the geographic needs. This is fairly anecdotal, but I will say that the early childhood director for the school district, I heard say in a meeting recently that they actually have spots open in their pre-K programs in some of the Southside schools, but are wait lists, have long wait lists at schools like Atalaya. I think the district would be the best source to provide more information on that, though, because I don't really know what that means or the implications for that. But that may be another great area to partner, for the city to partner with the district to really assess that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that point about the pre-Ks, I know that just in a lot of the conversations that the pre-Ks have open spots because the hours don't work. So again, we're running into this ending at 3 Monday through Thursday, 11:30 on Friday, with the exception of, I think, Aspen might be the only school that provides that aftercare. Yes, that would absolutely be part of that. I have just one question, and one thing that I've really struggled with is we kind of look at these other pieces about expanding sites, is the reports that have come back from a lot of providers that some of them do have the space and not the staffing. And so the staffing seems to be a little bit of ground zero, is what I've seen, is that even if we were to offer up city spaces, work with the school district to utilize their space, that there still is not the early childhood education staff to really be able to open up those spaces and maintain the ratios that are required and really needed for high quality care. Is my perception of that still accurate?
I think that those two issues go hand in hand. I would say that many of the programs are operating at space capacity. There are a few that are not. There was one that specifically noted that that was due to staffing. And in order to have expansion, most of them will need additional space in addition to that staffing. But I would agree, staffing keeps coming up, and it's an ongoing need. And if we're going to expand our supply, we're going to need to further expand staffing.
And one thing that you brought up in the report that I thought was really interesting and important for us to think about as Santa Fe is that even with the state dollars, which are wonderful, I mean, again, up to 400% of the federal poverty level, families get free child care right now, full-time free child care, and assuming they can find a space. That's the hard part. But the reimbursement levels are based on the state's minimum wage, and Santa Fe does have a higher minimum wage, and so the providers in Santa Fe are still running into a little bit of a funding gap there because they are not, if they're not a 5-star, correct, they are not getting the reimbursement levels that would go as far here as they might in some other locations, correct?
I agree that that's a significant issue, and I would also add, even for 5-star programs, their reimbursement rates are higher, but they also are paying their staff higher rates often, and they need to maintain lower ratios. And so I would say across the board, including for 5-star centers, those reimbursement rates are an issue.
Yeah, thank you. Sounds like a lot of those different puzzle pieces. So again, I really do appreciate all the work that you've put into this and painting a roadmap for how the city can continue to move forward. Really, we would like to see Santa Fe be a leader in this area. I will say, as someone who's really been steeped in this work for the last, year or so, Julie, the partners that we have in our community are really phenomenal. And so we are so fortunate with Growing Up New Mexico, with the Early Childhood Steering Committee, with our state representatives. We really are lucky that we have a lot of the players. I mean, the Chamber of Commerce, it's really been incredible to watch the Chamber of Commerce start to take this on, and they have been having meetings with different businesses to talk about how they can support employers and creating employer-based childcare. And there's a lot of different challenges. When we talk about space, that actually becomes a really interesting conversation because it's not as simple as we have an empty building. There are requirements for how much natural light per classroom, per access, and that the natural light can't be coming from a different room and filtering it. I mean, it's really, making sure that there is a quality space for children, safe playgrounds. I think I recently got a quote about how much a playground costs for people to be able to stand up that's appropriate. So how we support those capital costs, I think, is a really interesting an interesting avenue that, as you mentioned, the state isn't playing in at the moment. So some opportunities for us to continue to explore. So again, thank you so much, and I look forward to, Julie, we will reschedule our meeting and continuing to have these conversations. Thank you. Okay, let me get my agenda back up, and we are moving on to consent. Item Q, this is a resolution updating the terms of approval included in resolution numbers 2020-24 and 2022-9 to change the permitted location of banners commemorating hometown heroes from the Cerritos Road corridor to the rail yard, Guadalupe Street, and greater downtown area. Is John Blair available? Do we have a staff member? Jesse, are you running to get John? Okay. Let's see if John comes. Still here. One moment, let me see if I can call him. Counselors, I'm assuming that the questions do require Mr. Blair. Am I correct?
Madam Chair, I actually had thought I was pulling a different item, but I do have a couple comments. I don't know if Councilor Garcia was under the same assumption if he had questions for this, but my comments were just that this is still a work in progress. We're still looking at how we can continue to work to meet the needs to where we can have all 350 plus banners hung at one time, because the current proposal in front of us would accommodate half of that, which means we would be on a rotating schedule, which puts us in a position where we now need to figure out where the resources are going to come from for installation and takedown of the banners. And so we're currently working on how we can maybe hopefully get the approval to have 2 banners per pole, which would be able to accommodate that need. My hopes are that we will get that approval, and if it needs to be an amendment, that could be heard as an amendment in the Public Works and Utilities Committee meeting next week. But with that being said, just want to kind of give that public update in regards to how we're working to try to accommodate all the banners being up at one time. I do want to reiterate that this is an interim solution. We're working towards a long-term solution as well, to figure out if the original location would work or if we have to find a brand new location for these banners. But it's imperative, and we're all working towards a solution to get them up this year. So with that, I do want to thank my colleagues that have co-sponsored this resolution for us tonight. And with that, no other further comments or questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Councilor Garcia. I apologize. I was texting Mr. Blair. Thank you so much for providing that update and clarification on really what this one is and some of the plans moving forward. So, Councilor Lee Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just really wanted to add my name to sponsorship if you know, and give any help that I can offer. So put my name on the resolution as well. That's all I really wanted to put it for. So thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Any other questions or comments at this time? And if not, what are the wishes of the committee?
Move for approval?
Second.
And then can I please get a roll call vote?
Counselor Chavez?
Yes.
Counselor Lee Garcia?
Yes.
Counselor Michael Garcia?
Yes.
Counselor Villarreal?
Yes.
Chair Cassett?
Yes. And that motion passes. Sorry, let me tell John that we're good. And, okay. Moving on to item R. This is consideration of a resolution adopting new procedural rules for city council standing committees. We have Jesse Guillen. Jesse? We have Jesse Guillen. I couldn't see you to answer any questions. Councilwoman Villarreal, floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking the time to do the next iteration of procedural rules to clarify our structures for our standing committees. And I just wanted to just ask just some clarifying questions about some of the reasonings behind just a few of the sections. And Jesse, thank you so much for doing the red line. I think it was helpful to see what was taken out, which was quite a bit. And I guess the question is to Councilwoman Cassett, there's a lot of other procedural stuff related to other committees that you and I have worked on, and I'm hoping we'll get to loop back into that. And is that why that was all removed, so that that will then be another process to cover those procedures?
That is correct. So these procedure rules only apply to the 3 city council standing committees. All of that other conversation that we were having about the more resident committees, the advisory committees, that is a kind of a larger fish to fry at this point with a few more conversations. And so, yes, that is exactly correct. Why so much was taken out, because it doesn't apply to the city council standing committees.
Okay, that's helpful. And then let me scroll down here. So we changed the name to the committee chair to presiding officer. Is that a term that is used in other municipalities? I've never heard that term, so I'm just curious how we came about with that.
Madam Chair, Councilor Villarreal, the term presiding officer is used in the governing body procedure rules as well to refer to the mayor, or in the mayor's absence, it could be the mayor pro tem or whoever's running the meeting. So in being consistent, we're saying presiding officer. In this case, it generally refers to the chair, but if the chair is not here, then it could be whoever's designated in that role.
Yeah, I remember it being in those procedural rules, and I was just curious if it was just a term we use in general. I've never, I mean, before we did the procedural rules for the governing body, that was just a term that seemed to capture all kind of aspects of taking a leadership role, and whether it's you cover for the chair or other. Okay. And then based on that committee chair, it talks about if the presiding officer is unable to designate another member as the presiding officer for that meeting, the member shall elect a member. So do we have to vote on that, or can we just decide among ourselves, like, you can chair? What were you all thinking?
So I think, so our scenario was, if something terrible happened, and
Right.
I got,
Heaven forbid.
I'm not going to even say terrible things. Had enough of that today. But that, yes, that there would be a vote that would happen, that the committee would basically appoint a chair via a vote. We could clarify that if we need to. We can make that amendment.
Well, I guess our meetings are long enough, and having to do another vote, like, hey, let's make a vote on a chair. Why don't we just decide between whoever's there, which will be 4 of us, right? If we could just decide, which is normally what we do. It's very informal. It's like, or the chair will just call somebody and say, hey, can you cover for me? Which I'm fine with that too. I don't know. I think we're adding like another bureaucratic step that I'm just like, do we have to elect a member? Can we just decide between the 4 of us? Or
I think we were going with a lot of times when we were looking at these rules, we were trying to take out the current individuals that are sitting here. So in the event that maybe there is a committee where there would be, I don't know, where there's not quite that agreement that could happen, you know, I feel like if I were gone and wasn't able to have somebody cover, the four of you would be able to amicably agree, and there wouldn't be kind of this challenge, and so to set that process in a situation where maybe that wouldn't necessarily occur based on who the members are as it does change.
So maybe we make it just like may elect a member, or I don't know, I guess I just feel like you just gave different scenarios. Some committees may have a different way of interacting than us, but I don't know, I'm just trying to think of simplifying things because it's already a long meeting process. And
in normal times, I mean, so again, this is like a scenario that like on the way here, the chair were to get hit by a bus and was not able to say, I'm going to be gone, you know, something unexpected happens. In normal, you know, if somebody were to be on vacation, they would just designate someone. So this is a pretty, we don't expect this to occur, but just in the scenario that the chair was not able to designate somebody,
okay,
that is where that election would happen. I think that the likelihood of that occurring is
got it.
slim to none.
So if it's not like an emergency situation, the presiding officer still can designate an alternate member. Got it.
Correct, and that is
Okay.
what would happen in that scenario.
Thank you. I had to clarify that in my brain, so. And then just curious, because this is hard for some of us that work full-time, although we do read our packets ahead of time. The 4 hour prior to let staff know that there's an item that we intend to pull. I was thinking, why 4, not 2, for those of us that, like, by 3 we will know for sure. Just to accommodate working folks. Or things that change, you know, sometimes we change, like, something, new information, and we're like, oh, yeah, I think I want to pull that now. So that's what worries me. Like, new information, those of us that are working, trying to get from one job to the next, and 4 hours prior to the meeting may not, maybe, I don't know, I just feel like it's too, it's a long time versus 2 hours, I think is sufficient time to staff to know that they're going to be having to pull something, or that they'll have to be there for the meeting. So I'm just curious, colleagues, if you have opinions about it, because for me, I'm like, 4 hours, I have to let you all know by 1 o'clock or something. So,
Madam Chair, Councilor Vidal, that was, we're essentially saying what's in the governing body procedure rules for governing body meetings, which is set at that 4 hour limit. That's, you know, designed to give staff enough time to know whether they need to, you know, come from the south side down here to attend a meeting. You can certainly propose an amendment to change it, but the 4 hours did come from the governing body and procedure rules, so we're being consistent.
yeah, I guess I understand it for governing body. I guess for committees, we're on so many committees that I'm like, oh, okay, every time I'm going to have to be like 1 o'clock, I have to tell somebody that I'm going to pull something, which usually I do know, and it does say that this isn't required, but it says that staff may not be able to be available. So, I don't know. I'm still thinking about that.
I don't believe that we were attached to the number of hours. It was simply just to be able to give staff that heads up, and so we don't have people waiting around, or similar today where they didn't expect to be there for some. So I don't think we were attached to a number of hours. We were simply just being consistent with governing body. So
Okay. I'll think about that. Maybe, I don't know if that warrants an amendment or not, so I'll think about that a little bit more. Let's see. I know this was in the language, and it was tweaked just a little bit, but it's duties and powers of the presiding officer, and they list them, and number 4 says, represent the council committee in public and to speak and act on behalf of the council committee. And I was trying to think of an example when that occurs, where they act on behalf of the council committee. Do you have an example, Jesse?
Madam Chair, Councilwoman Villarreal, I can't think of a time that Chair has acted on behalf of the committee. I know that they have spoken on behalf of the committee. If you're in a governing body meeting, the chair will say, you know, at quality of life, we did X, Y, and Z. So that's what this would represent. I can't think of an example where they would act on behalf of the committee because there are, you have certain limitations on what you're able to do. So
Yeah.
I'll try and come up with a scenario where.
I was trying to think of, the speak one I understood. That one, like if it's, is that a governing body or in budget hearings, the chair would speak about on behalf of what occurred in the council. But the act on, I was like, I don't get that one. So if we don't have an example, maybe we should just take it out. Because I think that was original language. So just flagging that. So debate and voting on this is the presiding officer generally recognizes committee members in the order which they request the floor. And the presiding officer shall allow the sponsor of the legislation the opportunity to make a motion and speak first on the item. So what if the sponsor is not on that specific committee, but they're there to speak about their item? So are they allowed to speak? The opportunity, not to make a motion, but to speak first on the item.
Madam Chair, Councilwoman, are you talking about if the sponsor is there but is not a member of the committee?
Exactly, yes.
I think that they would be allowed to speak but not make a motion since they're not on the...
Do we need to, I guess I'm wondering if we need language to state that. I know it's not for debate though, but, so I guess I don't know if it falls under this, but I just want to make sure, like, sponsor, they be the first to talk about an item, even though they're not on that committee, and would they be allowed to speak first?
I believe that it's really referring to people that are members of the committee, so a sponsor could be there to respond to questions, or if, the item is pulled and you could give the opportunity, would you like to speak to this item, before questions are asked. Obviously, they cannot act, so we could put in some clarifying language around that they cannot move the item, and they cannot, they can't make any motions to any piece of it. We ran into the same conversation with amendments as well, that even if a sponsor of amendment is at the committee, they cannot move the amendment themselves. It has to be a member of the committee who's actually making motions.
Okay. And then likewise, I was thinking about a counselor or even the mayor, if they're not on the committee, who's not on the committee, but they're in attendance and they want to ask a question on an item. This doesn't clarify that they can do that.
That would be at the prerogative of the chair. So the chair does have the option to allow people, we frequently do it as a governing body. It is kind of one of those things that's in practice, but that the chair can essentially allow members who are not on the committee if they would like to ask a question or not, or they can not allow it based on, if the meeting's going extremely long and say, we're done, we're going to limit it to members of the committee. So that option is there, although frequently with us, we do allow that privilege to other members of the governing body who are not on the committee.
Yeah, I think that most of the time it works out. And then I guess because we're legislating and trying to cover everything with our procedural rules, those were two things that came about that if we needed to find that.
Madam Chair, Councilwoman, I'd just point you to the budget hearings where everyone is allowed to come to those finance meetings to discuss the budget, but it's only the finance committee who actually votes to move those on to the governing body. So that's a common example of where there are, the whole governing body is there to ask questions and talk about it, but it's only the 5 members of the committee that actually vote on it. It's not a common occurrence at other meetings, but I know there have been examples where sponsors have shown up to committee meetings for which they're not members to talk about the legislation. And my recollection is that generally the chair, presiding officer, gives them the opportunity to speak first, and then it goes to the members of the actual committee to discuss and ask questions.
And I don't know if we need to say that explicitly, and it may not even be under debate and voting. I don't think it would be on that section, but I just want to make sure people that are not part of a committee know that they can speak on their item if they're a sponsor, and also they can be there in attendance and you know, I do agree, it depends on the situation about asking questions, we usually do. So, and where would that go, really, in this section?
Jesse, is this prerogative of the chair? We had a whole debate about a prerogative of the chair section.
Madam Chair, Councilwoman, which we did not put in. I'll talk to Aaron and see if it's necessary, and if so, where.
Yeah, I'd like to
Would be.
just know that, so that people know, especially if they're new, they don't know that that's like a prerogative of the chair, or they don't know that it's possible. So I think if you could just let me know if it's needed. We don't have a section called prerogative of the chair, but I would like to make sure that if, especially if we're sponsoring an item, we can be able to have that space at the beginning. And I think that's it. Those are all the questions I have. I mean, ultimately, I think this is helpful and clear, and that we have, you know, it's a good, the structure's good, and that we have, you know, definitions and things that we need. And just some of these nuances I just want to clarify before we get to the next. Let's see, when does this go to Public Works and then Finance? Okay, so maybe, Jesse, you could let me know what you find out. That's all I have. Thank you.
Jesse, did you have something to say? You gave me a little.
Madam Chair, Councilors, I just wanted to point out that we did have a late amendment to the resolution, so if you refresh your screens, it'll pop up. That was it my suggestion that we change how the, let me see what page it's on. Page 4 of the rules where it talks about the agenda. We wanted to put a, take out approval of minutes from a section and put it, and just have it under consent like we do at the governing body. So that's a change. And then also we added items about which the presiding officer does not anticipate discussion to be under consent. That gives the chair a little more leeway to put things on discussion that they think might be pulled anyways. Because right now, there's very few items go on discussion. It's for the most part, it's generally empty unless there's some specific reason it's going there. Also, matters from staff, matters from the committee, and matters from the chair were not in the original procedure rules, and that's those are on the agendas for the 3 council committees, so we added that as well.
That was fast. I don't think, I haven't had a chance to look at these. I didn't see them.
The only substantive change is really putting approval of the minutes under consent as opposed to its own section item, like you did this evening where you approved the minutes from the previous meeting, and now would go under consent like we do it at governing body.
And then really just making more clear that items about which the presiding officer does not anticipate discussion can go on to discussion. Those, the chair already does have the ability to do that, so the chair already could arrange and put something on a discussion. This just spells it out to make it clear that that is a possibility. Any other questions or comments from the committee?
Madam Chair, so the only amendment change was the, for proposed rules, strike the paragraph AGJ, and then replace it with this order for that minutes.
Correct. So minutes going on to consent agenda, and then spelling out that matters from staff, matters from committee, and matters from the chair are on a standard agenda.
Got it, okay.
And then clarifying further that that is something that the chair does have the ability to automatically put something on discussion.
Thank you.
Got a question.
Councilor Michael Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I mean, I don't understand the need for F2 and G, because in committee, all we've got is our consent. We don't have discussion topics. And if we need to discuss a topic, it's as easy as somebody pulling it. I don't think we need to add an additional agenda item to ensure that an item gets discussed. So I'm unclear of this, and given the lateness of the amendment, I think it's still got 2 committees to go through. We have plenty of time to add it before it goes to governing body, so I don't feel comfortable voting on this amendment tonight.
I will just say that we actually do have action items discussion already on the agenda. We don't frequently use it, but it does already show up on the agenda. But I have no qualms with this being considered at another committee, as it did show up quite late in the packet.
And I guess, Madam Chair, I got one thing I'd like to point out, is that the Prime Gov agenda is completely different from the public version portal, because for many times because I look at the public version, and many times I see the chair say, well, executive session, that's not on the public version of the agenda. And so one thing we need to ensure that is consistent is both versions of the agendas are the same, because it doesn't seem like that's not consistent, because again, on the public version, there's not the action items portion or executive session that I've seen in the past. So I think that's what we need to also ensure, is that there's the consistency with the way the agendas are built out.
Okay, thank you. Jesse is here as our Prime Gov liaison to take note. Any other additional questions or comments from the committee? And if not, what are the wishes of the committee?
Move to approve.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Loretta, can I please get a roll call?
Counselor Chavez?
Yes.
Counselor Lee Garcia?
Yes.
Counselor Michael Garcia?
Yes.
Counselor Villarreal?
Yes.
Chair Cassett?
Yes.
Motion passed.
Okay. Moving on, Counselor Garcia pointed out, nothing on action items, no executive. On to matters from staff. Loretta, any matters today?
Madam Chair, there are no matters.
Any matters from the committee? And matters from the chair, I have none. Our next meeting is Wednesday, August 3rd at 6:22. We are adjourned. Thank you.